Tom opened his eyes to darkness. His head ached, and his body felt stiff with cold. A loud ringing filled his ears. He tried to move but found himself strapped to his seat. The last thing he remembered was the ship shaking violently, alarms blaring, and then a crash. The emergency lights inside the wreckage flickered weakly, casting a dull red glow. Tom unfastened his seatbelt with shaky hands and forced himself up. His breath came out in white puffs. It was freezing. Shattered metal and broken wires hung from the ceiling. Sparks flew from damaged control panels. The ship's main screen was cracked, but Tom could still see the display. ESYSTEM failure. Distress Sci-Fi. Sent. That was his only hope now. Someone had to find him. But how long would it take? Hours? Days? He checked the crew seats. They were empty. No signs of life. He was alone. Tom's survival training kicked in. Find warmth. Find shelter. Stay alive. He grabbed a survival kit from under the seat and forced the emergency hatch open. A blast of icy wind hit him instantly. The air was thin, dry, and painfully cold. Snow covered everything in sight, stretching endlessly into the horizon. His boots crunched in the fresh snow as he stepped outside. The planet's sky was a deep, dark blue with no sun in sight. The only light came from distant stars. Jagged mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks lost in heavy clouds. Tom tightened his jacket, but it wasn't enough. His fingers were already going numb. He had to move. His ship was broken, and staying near it meant freezing to death. There had to be something. A cave, a shelter, anything, where he could wait for rescue. Taking careful steps, Tom trudged forward through the deep snow. Each step was exhausting. The wind howled, almost as if it were alive, whispering warnings in his ears. Minutes passed, then an hour. His body was getting weaker. His legs felt heavy. His fingers stopped tingling, which was a bad sign. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was dangerous. Then he saw it. A dark shape in the distance. A cave. A structure. He wasn't sure, but it was his only chance. Forcing his frozen legs to move faster, he stumbled toward it. His vision blurred. His body screamed for rest. But if he stopped now, he wouldn't get up again. He fell. The snow cushioned his fall, but he couldn't get back up. His body refused to listen. The world around him dimmed. Just as he was about to close his eyes, he saw movement. A figure appeared in the snowstorm, walking toward him. Not human. Slender, tall, with glowing silver eyes. Its skin was pale blue, and its hair, long and flowing, shimmered under the dim light of the stars. An alien. Tom wanted to speak, but his voice wouldn't come. The cold had stolen his strength. The alien knelt beside him, tilting its head as if studying him. Then, without hesitation, it lifted him up, holding him with surprising ease. Tom's mind fought to stay awake, but the warmth of the alien's arms was overwhelming. His last thought before the darkness took him was simple. I am not alone. Tom's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The last thing he remembered was the cold, the storm, and then her. Now he was lying on something soft, covered in thick fur. A warm glow flickered nearby. He turned his head slightly and saw a fire burning inside a stone pit. A cave. His body still ached, but the warmth made it bearable. His fingers tingled as sensation slowly returned. He lifted his arm weakly and noticed that his jacket had been removed, replaced with a heavy, fur-lined cloak. Then he heard footsteps. Tom turned his head toward the sound. She stood near the fire, watching him. The alien girl. She was tall and slender, with pale blue skin and silver eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Her long white hair flowed past her shoulders, and she wore layered clothing made of fur and leather. A small curved blade rested at her hip. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Tom tried to sit up, but his body protested. His muscles were still weak. Seeing his struggle, the alien stepped closer. She knelt beside him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, as if telling him not to move. Her fingers were warm. Tom swallowed, unsure of what to do. He wanted to speak, but what would he even say? Would she understand him? "Thank you," he said finally, his voice rough. The alien girl tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, a series of soft, musical sounds, like a language made of whispers and echoes. Tom didn't understand a word. She seemed to realize this and frowned slightly. Then, without speaking again, she picked up a wooden bowl from beside the fire and held it toward him. Tom hesitated, but his hunger won over his caution. He reached out with shaky hands and took the bowl. Inside was a thick, steaming liquid, a kind of soup. He sniffed it. The smell was earthy and unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. He took a small sip. Warm, savory, life-giving. Tom let out a deep breath. "This is good." The alien girl said nothing but watched him closely as he drank. As he finished, he pointed at himself and said, "Tom." She blinked, then pointed at him. "Tom," she repeated, her voice soft. He nodded. Then he pointed at her. "And you." For a moment, she hesitated. Then she touched her chest lightly and said, "Rin." "Rin," Tom repeated. A small smile touched her lips. They had a start, a fragile understanding. Over the next few hours, Tom and Rin tried to communicate. It was slow, frustrating, but fascinating. Tom learned that Rin's language was complex, full of soft sounds and gestures. He mimicked her words, and she laughed softly when he got them wrong. He also learned that she was alone. There were no other people in the cave, no signs of a village or family. She had saved him, but there was no one to save her. At some point, Tom noticed something else. She kept looking toward the entrance of the cave, as if expecting something, or watching for danger. He frowned. "Are we safe here?" Rin didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Her silver eyes darkened. She stood up and walked to the cave entrance. Tom forced himself to sit up and followed her gaze. Outside, the snowstorm had ended. The sky was still dark, but something about the silence felt wrong. Then, far in the distance, a low, echoing howl broke the air. Rin tensed immediately, her hand moving to her blade. Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Something was out there, and it was hunting. The distant howl sent a shiver down Tom's spine. He didn't know what kind of creature made that sound, but one thing was clear: it was dangerous. Rin stood at the entrance of the cave, her silver eyes sharp. Her hand rested on the handle of her blade, fingers tight. Tom could see it in her posture. She was ready to fight. Tom swallowed hard. He had no weapon, no way to protect himself. If something attacked, he would be helpless. He turned to Rin and pointed outside. "What is it?" She didn't understand his words, but she understood his question. Instead of answering, she reached down and grabbed a small stone. She tossed it a few feet outside the cave. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the darkness, something moved. A shadow shifted near the snow-covered rocks. It was large, almost invisible against the white landscape. Then Tom saw them. Two glowing eyes staring straight at him. His breath caught in his throat. The creature let out another low growl, a deep rumbling sound that made the ground feel smaller beneath him. Rin slowly stepped back. She grabbed Tom's arm and pulled him deeper into the cave. He didn't resist. His heart pounded, and his mind screamed run, but he forced himself to stay quiet. The creature didn't enter the cave. It sniffed the air, then turned and slinked back into the storm. Only when the glowing eyes disappeared did Rin relax. She let out a slow breath and looked at Tom. "Zirak," she said, voice calm but firm. Tom frowned. "Zirak." She nodded, then mimicked sharp claws with her hands and made a biting motion. Tom didn't need a translator for that. A predator. A hunter. He exhaled slowly. Great, just great. Wren pointed at him, then made a sleeping motion with her hands. She wanted him to rest. Tom hesitated, but he was exhausted. His body still ached from the cold, and his mind was heavy. He lay back down, pulling the thick fur over himself. As his eyes closed, he saw Wren sitting by the fire, her blade in her lap, watching over him. She was protecting him, learning to survive. The next morning, Tom woke to the sound of crackling fire and the smell of something cooking. He sat up and saw Wren roasting a piece of meat over the flames. She glanced at him and gestured toward the food. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten much since the crash. He gratefully took the piece of meat and bit into it. It was chewy, slightly bitter, but warm and filling. As he ate, he watched Wren move around the cave. She checked supplies, sharpened her blade, and studied the entrance carefully, as if expecting the Zorak to return. Tom knew he couldn't just sit here and let her do everything. If he wanted to survive, he had to help. He stood up slowly, stretching his sore muscles. He pointed at himself, then at Wren, and made a walking motion. Wren raised an eyebrow, but seemed to understand. She nodded and handed him a long wooden stick, the closest thing to a weapon he would get. Together, they stepped out into the cold. The storm had passed, but the land was still harsh. Snow stretched for miles, and the wind carried a deep chill. Wren led the way, moving with careful, silent steps. Tom followed her example, trying not to make too much noise. He quickly realized that Wren was an expert at survival. She knew exactly where to step, how to avoid loose snow, and where to look for hidden dangers. After some time, she stopped near a small frozen lake. She knelt down and tapped the ice with her blade. Tom watched as she chipped away at the surface, breaking through to the water below. Then, with quick hands, she pulled out a small silver fish. Tom's eyes widened. That's how you get food. Wren smirked slightly, as if amused by his reaction. She handed him the blade and gestured for him to try. Tom hesitated, then knelt down and copied her movements. He carefully chipped away at the ice, his fingers stiff from the cold. When he finally broke through, he reached into the water, feeling the freezing liquid bite his skin. Then, he caught one. He pulled out the slippery fish, grinning despite himself. Wren gave him a small nod of approval. They were starting to understand each other. A growing bond. As the sunless sky darkened, they returned to the cave. Tom felt more confident now, knowing he had contributed to their survival. That night, as they sat by the fire, he pointed at the sky. "Earth," he said, then placed a hand on his chest. "My home." Wren watched him curiously. He picked up a small rock and drew a rough circle in the dirt. Then he pointed at it. "Earth." Then he pointed at her. Wren hesitated. Then she drew a different symbol next to his, a strange shape, almost like a spiral. She touched it and said, "Zayn." Tom repeated the word, "Zayn, your home." She nodded, but her expression darkened. Sadness. Loss. Tom realized then her home wasn't just far away. It was gone. His chest tightened. He didn't know how or why, but Wren had lost everything. Just like him. For the first time since he crashed, Tom didn't feel alone anymore. Tom's breath came out in white puffs as he sat near the fire, sharpening the wooden spear Wren had given him. His body still ached, but he was stronger now. The last few days had been tough, but he was learning. Learning to survive, learning to understand Wren. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She spoke little, but her actions said everything. She was careful, watchful, always alert. She had saved his life, taught him how to catch food, and even shared what little she had. Now he wanted to do something for her. Tom looked at Wren as she prepared the dried meat they had collected. She looked tired, not from physical exhaustion, but from something deeper, a loneliness that weighed heavy on her shoulders. His gaze shifted to the cave entrance. The thought of Zirak, the beast that lurked in the snow, still haunted him. Rin had mentioned the name before, and the way she gripped her weapon that night made it clear. It wasn't just a predator. It was a killer. And it was still out there. Tom stood up and walked to the entrance. Rin noticed and frowned. "Tom, checking," he said, stepping outside. The air was sharp and cold, but the sky was clearer than before. Snow stretched out in every direction, and the distant mountains stood like silent giants in the dark. Then he saw something. Footprints. Large, deep, leading toward the cave, but stopping only a few feet away before turning back into the darkness. Tom's stomach tightened. The Zirak had been watching them. The plan. Tom rushed back inside. "Rin, we have a problem." She looked at him, confused. He knelt down and drew the tracks in the dirt. Then he pointed outside, making a stalking motion with his fingers. Rin's expression darkened. She understood. She slowly placed her knife down and stood. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes sharp. She had known this would happen. Tom didn't want to just sit and wait to be hunted. "We need a plan," he said. He pointed at himself, then at her, and then made a fighting gesture. Rin exhaled slowly. She walked over to the wall and pulled something out of the shadows, a bow, and 3 arrows. Tom's eyes widened. He hadn't seen that before. Rin held the bow with ease, testing the string before nodding. Then she pointed at Tom's spear and gave a short nod of approval. They were going to fight together. Setting the trap. The two worked quickly. Rin led Tom to a spot near the cave where the snow was soft and deep. She handed him a sharp stone, and together they dug a pit. It wasn't deep, but with the right angle, it would be enough to slow the beast down. Then they sharpened long wooden spikes and placed them at the bottom. If the Zirak fell in, it wouldn't escape easily. As a final step, they covered the pit with thin branches and snow, making it look like solid ground. When they finished, Tom wiped sweat from his forehead. "I hope this works." Rin didn't answer, but she tightened her grip on her bow. They returned to the cave and waited. The attack. The night was silent. Too silent. Tom sat near the fire, gripping his spear tightly. Rin stood near the entrance, bow in hand, eyes locked on the darkness outside. Then it came. A low growl rumbled through the air. Heavy footsteps crunched against the snow. The Zirak was close. Tom's heart pounded. He glanced at Rin. She gave him a small nod. "Stay calm. Wait." Then the beast stepped into view. Tom's breath caught in his throat. The Zirak was even bigger than he imagined. It stood on 4 powerful legs, its body covered in thick, white fur that blended perfectly with the snow. Its eyes glowed like burning embers, locked onto the cave. Locked onto them. It was hunting. The Zirak let out a deep snarl and stepped forward, right onto the trap. The ground collapsed beneath it. The beast roared in surprise as it crashed into the pit, its body slamming against the sharpened stakes. Tom didn't wait. He grabbed his spear and rushed forward. The Zirak thrashed wildly, trying to pull itself free. One of the spikes had pierced its leg, slowing it down, but it was still strong. Rin moved first. She raised her bow, took a deep breath, and released an arrow. The sharp tip sank into the creature's shoulder. It howled in pain, turning its head toward her. But before it could react, Tom struck. He drove his spear straight into its side, pushing with every ounce of strength he had. The Zirak let out a final, shuddering breath, then went still. Silence. Tom stayed frozen for a moment, heart hammering, breath heavy. Then Rin stepped beside him, bow still raised. She looked at the dead creature, then at Tom. And for the first time, she smiled. Tom let out a shaky laugh. "We did it." Rin nodded. Then she touched her forehead to his, a gesture of respect. Tom didn't understand her words, but he understood her meaning. They were survivors. together. The Zirek lay still in the pit, its massive body half buried in the snow. Tom took a deep breath, his hand still gripping the spear tightly. The fight had been short but brutal. His arms ached, his heart pounded, but most of all, he felt alive. Beside him, Rin stood motionless, her silver eyes locked onto the creature. She lowered her bow slowly and let out a small breath. It was over. Tom turned to her. "We did it," he said, though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. Still, Rin gave a small nod. Then she stepped forward and touched the creature's fur, inspecting the deep wounds. She muttered something in her own language, soft, almost like a whisper. Tom watched, confused. She didn't look relieved. She looked worried. A troubling discovery. Rin pulled out her blade and carefully cut a piece of the Zirek's thick fur. Then she examined the wounds again, her fingers tracing along its side. Tom frowned. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to him and pointed at the deep scratches along the creature's back. They were fresh, but they weren't from their fight. Tom's stomach tightened. Something else had attacked this creature. Recently. Rin stood up quickly, gripping her knife. She scanned the dark, snowy horizon, her entire body tense. Tom followed her gaze, suddenly feeling exposed. The wind howled softly, but there were no other sounds. No birds, no distant howls, just silence. The Zirek hadn't been hunting them. It had been running from something. Moving quickly. "We need to go," Tom said, his voice low. He pointed at the cave, then at the dead creature, shaking his head. "It's not safe." Rin didn't need words to understand. She gave a sharp nod and grabbed what they could carry, extra fur, meat, and the Zirek's sharp teeth for tools. Tom helped as quickly as possible, his hands moving fast despite the cold. Every second outside felt dangerous now. Once they had everything, they hurried back toward the cave. Rin kept looking over her shoulder, scanning the snowy landscape. Tom didn't dare ask what she was expecting to see. He had a bad feeling he already knew. A distant shadow. By the time they reached the cave, the sky had darkened. Tom set down the supplies, breathing heavily. His muscles ached from the fight, but adrenaline still ran through his veins. Rin, however, didn't stop. She stood at the entrance, staring out into the frozen wasteland. Tom followed her gaze and froze. Far in the distance, beyond the hills of ice and rock, something moved. It was tall. It was fast. And it was watching them. Tom's throat went dry. "What is that?" Rin didn't answer. She just reached for her bow. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. And it wasn't friendly. Tom stood frozen at the entrance of the cave, his breath coming in short, nervous puffs. The shadow in the distance was moving. Slowly, carefully, like a predator stalking its prey. Beside him, Rin's grip tightened on her bow. Her silver eyes were sharp, scanning the figure against the snowy landscape. The wind howled between them, carrying the distant crunch of footsteps. Tom swallowed hard. "What is that?" Rin didn't answer. Instead, she raised her bow, pulled back an arrow, and aimed straight at the figure. Tom's heart pounded. If she was ready to attack, then that meant it was a threat, a silent warning. For a long moment, the figure didn't move. It stood tall, its form barely visible through the falling snow. Then, slowly, it turned away and disappeared into the white haze. Rin didn't lower her bow. She stayed still, watching the empty space where the shadow had been. Tom could feel the tension in her body. Finally, she exhaled and lowered the weapon. Tom let out a shaky breath. What was that? Rin hesitated, then drew a rough shape in the snow, a tall figure with long limbs. Tom frowned. Not an animal. She shook her head. A chill ran down his spine. If it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't human, then what was it? Preparing for the unknown, the cave felt smaller than before, as if the walls were closing in. Tom paced back and forth, his mind racing. "This is bad," he muttered. "Something was watching us, and we don't even know what it is." Wren ignored his words but understood his concern. She worked quickly, using the Xerax fur to create a stronger barrier near the entrance. It wouldn't stop a real attack, but it might help them hide. Tom sat near the fire, sharpening his wooden spear. "We need a real plan," he said. "We can't just sit here and wait." Wren glanced at him, then nodded. She pulled a small folded map from her pack and spread it on the ground. Tom leaned closer, surprised. "You have a map." She pointed at a marked location not far from their cave. Then she made a sheltering motion with her hands. Tom frowned. "A safe place." She nodded. "A possible shelter. A better location. Maybe even others like her." Tom felt a spark of hope. "We should go," he said. "Tomorrow." Wren agreed, but her expression remained serious. Because whatever was out there in the snow, it wasn't going to let them leave easily. A night of fear. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the cave walls. Tom tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Watcher, standing there, waiting. He turned to Wren. She sat by the entrance, her bow across her lap, her body completely still. She wasn't sleeping either. Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere in the distance, something let out a low, strange cry. Tom shivered. Tomorrow, they had to move. Because if they stayed here too long, the Watcher would return. The night had been long. Every sound outside the cave made Tom's heart race. He barely slept, and he knew Wren hadn't either. By morning, the fire had burned low, and the cold had settled deep into his bones. But there was no time to rest. They had made a decision. They had to leave. Leaving the cave, Tom tightened the fur cloak Wren had made for him. It wasn't perfect, but it helped against the freezing wind. He grabbed his spear, adjusted the small bag of supplies on his back, and turned to Wren. She was already ready, her bow strapped to her shoulder, her knife at her waist. She looked at him and gave a short nod. It was time. Stepping outside, Tom felt the full force of the cold. The sky was covered in thick, gray clouds. Snow stretched endlessly in every direction. Their footprints disappeared almost instantly under the wind's touch. He looked back at the cave, the only shelter he had known on this planet. It had saved his life, but staying there any longer meant certain death. With one last glance, he turned away and followed Wren into the wild. Through the frozen wasteland, the journey was slow and difficult. They walked through deep snow, their feet sinking with every step. The wind howled around them, carrying whispers of the unknown. Wren led the way, her movements quick and sure. She knew this land. She avoided open areas and chose paths between large rocks where they were less visible. Tom followed closely, gripping his spear tightly. He kept looking around, scanning the distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Signs of trouble. After hours of walking, they stopped near a frozen river. Tom was exhausted. His legs burned, and his hands felt numb despite the fur. Wren knelt beside the river and checked the ice. She muttered something in her own language, then stood up quickly. Tom frowned. "What is it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed at the snow nearby. Tom's stomach dropped. Footprints. But they weren't theirs. The prints were larger, deeper, and they followed their path, as if something had been tracking them. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. "We need to move," he said. Wren agreed. They quickened their pace. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The chase begins. Not long after, Tom heard it. A distant howl, low and deep, carried by the wind. His blood turned to ice. Wren froze beside him. Her grip on the bow tightened, and her breath came out in quick, short puffs. She turned to Tom and made a clear motion. "Run." He didn't ask questions. He ran. Snow kicked up behind him as he followed Wren, his legs burning with effort. He could hear the heavy footsteps behind them now. Something was coming. Something fast. The ground shook slightly, and another howl echoed through the air, closer this time. Tom dared a glance back, and what he saw made his heart stop. A dark shape moved through the snow, running on all fours. It was huge, with long limbs and glowing red eyes. The Watcher had found them. A desperate escape. Ren grabbed Tom's arm and pulled him toward a rocky ridge. It was their only chance. If they could get to higher ground, maybe they could lose it. Tom ran harder, his breath coming in gasps. The wind roared in his ears. His legs screamed for rest, but he pushed forward. The creature closed in. Ren reached the rocks first and climbed up swiftly. Tom followed, using his hands to pull himself up. His fingers were numb, his arms shaking, but he didn't stop. Then, a loud snarl. Tom felt the ground tremble as the beast leaped forward. He threw himself over the ledge just in time. The creature slammed into the rock below, missing him by inches. It let out a furious roar, its red eyes blazing. Tom scrambled to his feet, gripping his spear. Ren already had her bow raised, an arrow ready to fly. The creature snarled up at them, then slowly backed away into the snow. It didn't leave. It was waiting. Tom's chest rose and fell rapidly. He turned to Rin. "What do we do now?" She looked at the beast below, then at the path ahead. Then she spoke one word. "Run." The fight wasn't over. The real battle had just begun. The air was thick with tension. Tom and Rin stood on the rocky ledge, breathing hard. Below them, the Watcher waited in the snow, its glowing red eyes locked onto them. It didn't leave. It didn't make a sound. It was patient. Tom gripped his spear tighter. He knew one thing. They couldn't stay here. Rin looked at him and made a quick motion with her hands. "Move quietly. Stay low." Tom nodded. They had no choice. They had to run. Into the unknown. Moving carefully, they climbed over the rocky ridge, keeping their bodies close to the ground. Every step was slow, deliberate. The Watcher stayed below, following their movements from a distance. It was hunting them. Tom's heart pounded. He glanced at Rin. Her expression was serious, focused. She had probably dealt with creatures like this before. But Tom, he was just trying to survive. The wind howled around them as they reached the other side of the ridge. Below, a thick forest of ice-covered trees stretched into the distance. Rin pointed forward. Tom understood. The trees could provide cover. They had to reach them. Fast. The race against time. Without warning, a deep snarl filled the air. Tom turned back and felt his blood freeze. The Watcher had climbed the ridge, and now it was charging. "Go," Rin shouted. Tom didn't think. He ran. Snow crunched beneath his feet as he sprinted down the rocky slope. His legs burned, his breath came in sharp gasps, but he didn't stop. The Watcher's heavy footsteps shook the ground behind him. It was fast, too fast. Rin spun around and fired an arrow. Whip. The arrow struck the creature's shoulder, but it barely slowed. It let out a furious roar and leaped toward them. Tom pushed himself harder. The trees were so close now. Almost there. Then, the ground disappeared beneath him. A deadly fall. Tom slipped. His foot hit a patch of ice, and suddenly he was falling. The world blurred as he tumbled down a steep slope, snow and ice rushing past him. Then, impact. Pain shot through his side as he landed hard on the frozen ground below. His vision spun, his breath knocked from his lungs. For a moment, everything was silent. Then he heard Rin's voice. "Tom." He forced himself to sit up, wincing. Above him, Rin stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down. She was safe. But the Watcher, Tom's heart stopped. It was standing right above him. Face to face with the beast. The creature loomed at the top of the slope, its red eyes glowing in the shadows. It let out a low growl, its massive claws digging into the ice. Tom scrambled back, his hands shaking. His spear. Where was his spear? There, a few feet away, half buried in the snow. The Watcher moved. Tom lunged for the spear and grabbed it just in time. The creature jumped. Tom rolled to the side as it crashed down where he had just been. The ice shattered beneath its weight. It turned toward him, growling. This was it. He had to fight. A desperate plan. Wren didn't hesitate. She grabbed a large rock and hurled it down at the creature. Smash! The rock hit its back. The Watcher roared in pain, turning toward her. Tom saw his chance. With all his strength, he thrust his spear forward. The sharp tip sank into the creature's side. The Watcher let out an ear-splitting scream. It staggered back, blood staining the snow. Tom pulled out the spear, heart racing. The beast wasn't dead, but it was injured. It gave him one last, furious glare, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. A moment of relief. Tom collapsed onto the snow, breathing hard. Above him, Wren climbed down carefully, her bow still in her hands. She looked at him, then at the blood on the ground. She didn't smile. "This isn't over," Tom muttered. Wren nodded. She knew the truth. The Watcher was still out there, and it would return. The journey continues. They couldn't stay here. They had to keep moving. With no time to rest, they headed toward the trees, disappearing into the icy forest. The real battle was yet to come. Would they survive what lay ahead? Only time would tell. The frozen forest stretched before them, silent and eerie. The ice-covered trees stood like frozen statues, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky. Tom and Wren moved carefully, their breaths visible in the cold air. Their bodies ached from the long journey, but they couldn't stop now. The Watcher was still out there, injured, angry, waiting. Tom gripped his spear tightly. His mind raced with one thought. This had to end. A dangerous path. They followed a narrow trail through the trees, their footsteps muffled by the thick snow. Wren led the way, her sharp eyes scanning for danger. Tom kept glancing over his shoulder. The Watcher was fast. It could strike at any moment. Then Wren stopped. She knelt and touched the snow. Tom frowned. "What is it?" She pointed. "Tracks. Fresh ones." His stomach tightened. It was close. Wren took a deep breath, then motioned for him to follow. They had no choice but to keep moving. The trap. Minutes passed. The air grew heavier. The trees felt closer. Then, a low growl. Tom's heart jumped. He spun around, raising his spear. The sound echoed through the trees, coming from all directions. Wren pressed her back against a tree, her bow ready. Her silver eyes were sharp, focused. A shadow moved between the trees. Then another. Tom's grip tightened. "There's more than one," he whispered. Wren nodded. The Watcher hadn't been alone. This wasn't just a hunt. It was an ambush. The battle begins. A blur of black fur leaped from the trees. Wren fired an arrow. Thwip! The creature yelped and crashed into the snow. But before they could react, two more lunged from the shadows. Tom barely dodged as one swiped at him. He rolled across the snow and thrust his spear forward. The tip slammed into the beast's side. It screeched and staggered back. Another one charged at Wren. She spun away and fired again, her arrow piercing its leg. The beast howled in pain. But they weren't stopping. They were surrounded. The fire plan. Tom's mind raced. They couldn't win like this. There were too many. Then he had an idea. "Fire!" he shouted. "We need fire." Wren's eyes widened in understanding. She grabbed a small flint stone from her pack. Tom kicked snow over the beasts to slow them down, then grabbed a dry branch. He struck the flint against his knife. Sparks flew. Crackle! The fire caught. Tom lifted the burning branch and waved it wildly. The creatures hesitated, their red eyes narrowing. They feared fire. Wren quickly lit another branch. She stepped forward, swinging it toward the beasts. One growled and backed away. Another snarled but didn't attack. It was working. Tom's confidence grew. "Go. Leave," he shouted. The creatures let out low growls, their bodies tense. For a moment, Tom thought they would still attack. But then, they retreated. One by one, they disappeared into the shadows, their glowing eyes fading. The forest was silent again. The final decision. Tom fell to his knees, breathing hard. His hands shook from both fear and exhaustion. Wren stood beside him, watching the darkness. She didn't lower her fire. "Not yet." "They'll come back," Tom muttered. "Won't they?" Wren nodded. This wasn't the end. The creatures still ruled this frozen land. But something had changed. Tom wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting back. He looked at Wren and saw the same thought in her eyes. They had a choice: keep running or make a stand. Tom gripped his spear and stood up. "I'm tired of running," he said. "Let's fight." Wren's lips curled into the slightest smile. She agreed. Together, they turned and walked deeper into the forest, ready for whatever came next. The end.